But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest.
To tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship.
Now, to go on to the word fascism, I would describe the type of government into which we have evolved as essentially fascist, yes.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Trust the experts, trust the experts. Trust the science, trust the science. CDC, CDC, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Fauci. Mask on, mask off, 2 shots, 1 shot, mask on, 2 masks. Comply, comply.
Welcome to the Exit Your Matrix podcast, where we take the deep dive in search of truth. On the journey, we examine critical topics such as natural law, consciousness, morality, individual sovereignty, and the occult. And here's your host, Brad Villers. Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of the Exit Your Matrix podcast. Thank you for coming back. So first of all, I want to talk about some items from the first episode and maybe clear the air on some things. First of all, in that intro, I used a little tongue-in-cheek remark, and I invoked the name of Elon when I did. And I just wanted to clarify what I meant by that. I have a little bit of a sarcastic sense of humor, and got some feedback that maybe what I intended was not what came through. So, what I meant by using that name was to make a little fun of the current discussion around Elon Musk being the savior of free speech and, of course, buying Twitter and all the things that he's doing. I'm not sure where that's going to end up, but what I can tell you is I don't buy the official narrative. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on. As I said, I think that time will tell, but if you really want some background on this in terms of what I think one of the best places to go is to Whitney Webb's podcast. It's called Unlimited Hangout, and I'll put this up here for you to see. So she has podcasts that she's done for quite a while. She is an investigative reporter and really did not have this as a background. She's a mom and has talked about this at length, but she was really concerned about what she was seeing. And so she started this website called Unlimited Hangout. And she has done a podcast, and most of her work really is centered around investigative journalists. And I will tell you that hands down, at least in terms of the people I've come across, she is by far the most in-depth journalist. She goes far deeper than anyone else, finds connections between things that I've never heard before, and does a really fantastic job. So high praise for her website, her podcast. But she happened to do a particular podcast called Behind the Twitter Files Hype. And interestingly enough, it was with James Corbett, was her guest. And James Corbett is an absolute icon, in my opinion. He is one of the people who is a part of a very small group that I would consider the gold standard when it comes to understanding what's really going on, understanding truth, trying to get behind some of the current events and what they really mean, how they're connected, and really an in-depth look. So I would highly encourage you to go check out this website, check out James Corbett's website, and his is called thecorbettreport.com. Both of them fantastic, but this podcast in particular goes into some things that you probably have never heard of in terms of what Elon Musk is all about, what that whole Twitter files situation is all about, and it has some excellent information. Sum and substance, I withhold judgment on this until we get a little further down the road, but I am not an Elon Muscovite. I do not believe he is a savior of free speech. I do not believe that all that there is that you see, at least in the mainstream media, is what there is to understand. So Another item I wanted to address is from the first podcast, and it deals with the portion towards the end where I covered the tenets of a receptive mind. And if you've seen that, one of them was the ability to say I was wrong and I don't know. Interestingly enough, in reading a book, which I do with a great friend of mine, David, we pick books, basically have a book club you would call it, and once a week we'll cover a chapter or chapters, and we're methodically going through books that are of interest. Well, we are reading a book by J. Krishnamurti called As One Is. And in preparation for that, there was a section I had not read, by the way. This is the important part. I had not read this yet when I did episode 1. But for our reading over the weekend, David and I covered, his book is organized into what he calls talks, because these were done to an audience in California when he did these way back in the 50s, I think. Now, if one can really come to that state of saying, I do not know, it indicates an extraordinary sense of humility. There is no arrogance of knowledge. There is no self-assertive answer to make an impression. When you can actually say, I do not know, which very few are capable of saying, then in that state all fear ceases, because all sense of recognition, the search into memory, has come to an end. There is no longer inquiry into the field of the known. Then comes the extraordinary thing. You will find that when you can say, I do not know, all conditioning has stopped. I thought that was very interesting, because I happen to be talking about the phrase, I do not know, or I don't know, and here a week later I'm reading an excerpt from a book about it. So these kind of coincidences, I think you might call them, I don't think they're coincidences, but they do happen, and it's quite interesting. So I just wanted to share that, because I thought that was a great quote that had to do with that section. I wish I had read it before episode 1 and I would have included it. So to today's content, let's talk about some macro themes. First of all, this is at its core about understanding ourselves. Truth, knowledge, freedom, all of those things ultimately are rooted in our ability to understand ourselves and understand how we function as human beings. I stressed that a lot in the first episode. And that comes through understandings of consciousness and the human brain, which we'll cover today in some depth. Secondly, there is knowledge that we can access, we can gain. It's out there and available to us. Oftentimes it's not obvious and we have to search for it, but there is information out there that we can use to aid in that awakening, to aid in that understanding of ourselves. But also it can be used as basically intellectual self-defense. It arms us and gives us the protection to be able to go into situations where we're faced with information we haven't seen before, or perhaps we are engaged with someone who would have us be thinking something that perhaps is not true, or try to put on us a belief system that is for their ends and beneficial to them, but not to us. So let's talk about what truth is. What is the definition of truth? It's a short word, but yet a big word in terms of its meaning and implications. And when I thought first about how you would define truth, I was baffled. I really didn't know what to think. But there is a definition that's offered by Mark Passio, which I think is brilliant. And I'm not exactly sure where he got it, but it's basically this. And I think when you really give it some thought, you'll understand that that's pretty accurate. And that is that the truth encompasses, or is, what has happened and what is happening. So if we think about that, it's hard to argue with what has happened and is happening. Those things have been observed, those incidents, those actions, etc. So on the heels of defining truth in that fashion, let's take a look at a quote from someone who I have come to find is truly fascinating, and that is Arthur Schopenhauer. And you can go ahead and see him there. Take a look at that look, at that presence. It's pretty awesome. Arthur Schopenhauer, born in 1788, died in 1860, and he was a German philosopher. And I will tell you, his Wikipedia page, when I went to consider printing it, was about 30 pages long. This is somebody who you should really look into and get an understanding of. I don't want to spend a ton of time going into his background here. He has some of the pithiest quotes that I have found in this process. And this he says of truth. All truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. Pretty interesting, I think. So at this point, I want to introduce an idea regarding consciousness. Now, consciousness is something that we are going to go into a little bit later in this episode. But for now, just stay with me and let's talk about this in a general sense, because I want to make a point here. There is this concept of a shared consciousness. So if you believe that we as individuals have a consciousness, which I do, and which many do, but there's debate about that, there's also this concept that many scholars and many thinkers believe is accurate, and that is that we are part of a shared consciousness. So that we are something like a node, for lack of a better term. There's probably a better way of describing it, but we are an individual consciousness that is part of a broader consciousness. So it's a shared situation and dynamic. So if we take that and at least accept that argument, then comes along the concept of what happens to shared consciousness when, in the aggregate, behavior or attitudes or beliefs tend to go in one direction or another. And really what suffering is all about is the shared consciousness engaged in practices where belief systems and axioms are not consistent with the reality of truth. And we do need to define axiom, I think, here, and that is a statement or position which has been accepted as already having been established as self-evident. So as far as I see, this begs some questions. What if the axioms and belief systems we're operating with are wrong? More personally, what if the axioms and belief systems you have are wrong? What if the people who told you and taught you these belief systems and axioms, where you got this information from, and I would assume you probably didn't challenge it. We get so much of this when we're young and impressionable, and we don't know to question it. I certainly didn't. But what if it's wrong? What if the people who taught you were wrong? Not by any intention, but what if they just didn't know any better either, and had inherited, basically, those beliefs and axioms from yet other people, from their parents, from their teachers? And what are the implications for this? So let's dig into the subject of human consciousness a little bit more. Let's talk about what it is, how it works, and we also need to spend some time on the physiology of the human brain. Before we kick that off, let's start with a quote from Soren Kierkegaard, who told us that there are only 2 ways that people are fooled. They believe that which is not true, or they refuse to believe that which is true. And by the way, I'm going to put up some names and photos of some of these people I'm quoting. I'm going to cover some of them who I don't think you're familiar with, but in some cases, a guy like Kierkegaard, I think, is fairly well known, so I'm not going to give a ton of background on him. But then we also go to someone who I've, again, found in this process, and that is Erich Hoffer. Hoffer was born in 1902 and died in 1983. He was an American moral and social philosopher and the author of 10 books. One interesting item is that by the age of 5, he could already read in both English and German. One incident that happened that obviously had a profound effect on him was that when he was 5, his mother fell down the stairs while she was holding him. She died very shortly after that, and then 2 years later, at the age of 7, he lost his sight. His eyesight inexplicably returned when he was 15, and then fearing that he might lose it again, he seized on the opportunity to read as much as he could. His recovery proved permanent, but he never abandoned his reading habit. So he then lost his father, again when he was fairly young, and he took a bus to Los Angeles and lived on Skid Row for about 10 years, just wandering apparently. And then he began work as a longshoreman on the docks of San Francisco in 1943, and that's around the time when he began his serious writing. His best-known book is called The True Believer, and in it he analyzes the phenomenon of mass movements. So we have this description, which is, the real attraction for this population is an escape from the self, not a realization of individual hopes. Quote, a mass movement attracts and holds a following not because it can satisfy the desire for self-advancement, but because it can satisfy the passion for self-renunciation, end quote. For the true believer, quote unquote, Hoffer argues that particular beliefs are less important than escaping from the burdens of the autonomous self. So the quote from Hoffer that I wanted to share is this: propaganda does not deceive people. It merely helps them to deceive themselves. What I find interesting about that is the similarity with Kierkegaard's quote. So he tells us that we either believe or refuse to believe. And Hoffer tells us that there is propaganda, but it doesn't do anything. It just helps us and facilitates us fooling ourselves. So in both cases, we see that it's not some third party, it's not other information, it's not outside of us, it is us. We are taking control of that information and we are using it either inappropriately or appropriately. So it's really all about us, and I get to that point again to say knowing ourselves is the critical and most vital part of this exercise. So this leads us to a few inescapable conclusions. First is that if our lives are lived in alignment with truth, the aggregate quality of our experience improves. Conversely, if our lives are lived out of alignment with truth, the aggregate quality of our experience diminishes. And again, earlier, I termed that suffering. That's why we experience suffering. So if truth can be known and the knowledge of truth is available to us, why don't we all have it? And there are really two reasons. And the first is nescience. And nescience is the absence of knowledge. It's not knowing or understanding that which a person is reasonably expected to know or understand. So the simple example here is a child. A child does not know the dangers of going up and approaching a dog that they don't know, for example. They don't know that, but a parent does. So there is a maturity at which we're supposed to understand certain things, but when we don't reach that point, we're not expected to understand. And the second is ignorance, and this is the really scary one. This is intentionally or actively resisting or ignoring that which you'd reasonably be expected to know or understand. So an example here is the classic one of the holiday meal where you're sitting down with family and you've got that one person or probably people who aren't in your camp, don't understand what you're talking about. So you bring something up and they lock up, as I call it. They are basically demonstrating ignorance. They are intentionally or actively resisting that information. So I'd like to take a quick aside here and again stress that this information, this knowledge I've been talking about, is readily available. You have to have some interest in doing it and you have to have some purpose in doing it to be able to find it, but it is out there. And so I'd like to take a moment and do a plug. I want to spend some time on this because this is huge. So I've mentioned Mark Passio as being a huge influence for me, but one of the things that he offers, which I think is amazing, and I took him up on, I have this, is what he calls the arc drive. And basically what this involves is he was asked by a friend to create a disk drive for his friend that encompassed critical information that Passio had developed and gathered over the years. And Mark's been pulling down videos and audio files and books and articles for a long, long time. So once this friend asked, he thought, why don't I offer this more broadly? And he did. And that is called the ARC drive. And ARC stands for Amazing Repository of Knowledge. So essentially what happens is if you will go to whatonearthishappening.com, Mark Passio's website, and look for the ARC tab, it will pull this up. And there's more to it. I just could fit what I have here on a screenshot. But this gives you the essentials. Basically, if you interact with him, you can send him a 2 terabyte disk drive, and he will populate it with almost 2 terabytes. I think the one that I got back had 5 gigabytes of free storage space on it. And it is unbelievable. As he says in his piece here, it consists of over 3,400 video files, 9,500 digital books, and 26,000 audio files. And what I can tell you is that I obviously sent off and got this, and I have been absolutely blown away. It covers topics that I would have really never thought to investigate, and covers them at length, in depth, and with multiple different sources sharing their opinions on it. And I don't agree with everything that's in it, and I don't think Mark does either. I can't encourage you enough to take advantage of this. I don't know anybody else who does this, and it's a pretty incredible offer that he's making. So if you're looking for information, if you're wondering about the knowledge that I'm talking about, there's your answer. It's right there. And if that doesn't give you a start, I don't know what will. And in fact, I don't know that I'll be able to digest all of that information in my lifetime, although I'm trying pretty hard. So within the confines of searching for truth, I wanted to talk about one of the biggest lies that I think has been told, and that is encapsulated in a term which is solipsism, and that is spelled S-O-L-I-P-S-I-S-M, and it's effectively defined as a philosophical notion that all that exists is one's own mind, and anything that may exist outside of one's own mind is uncertain. So this is really the origins of the terminology that I think we have all heard and perhaps has even come off of our tongues, and that is perception is reality. So this was really interesting when I came across this term solipsism, because I hadn't heard the term, but I had heard the concept of not being able to know anything for certain, and that truth was actually not able to be attained. And so that goes back to decades ago, and I don't have the greatest memory, but I remembered an article that I had read in Fortune magazine. So this goes back to the early 2000s, well before I had started my awakening, and I was still reading all sorts of mainstream type publications, and one of them that I was religiously reading was Fortune magazine. I've worked in a corporate environment pretty much all my life, so I was pretty interested in what was going on in that world. And I am telling you, when my Fortune magazine came in the mail, I grabbed it, I went home, and I knew what I was going to do for the next few nights, which was be just pouring through that. I mean, that was my bedtime reading at the time. So I recall that there was this article about Robert Rubin, and I don't have the greatest memory, but that article just stuck out for me. And it stuck out for the same reason, and that was he advocated that truth could not be known. And so let me give you a little bit of background about Robert Rubin. You may know he was the 70th United States Secretary of the Treasury during the Clinton administration. He was also chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations from 2007 to 2017. He is co-chairman emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is credited as a major force behind Clinton-era economic prosperity, including the 1993 Deficit Reduction Act and Balanced Budget Act of 1997. Now listen to this. However, critics of Rubin have since argued that the bank-friendly policies he supported contributed to the financial crisis of 2007-2008. So I would call attention to what he's all about and what his motives might be. But in any case, to the article. So this appeared in the December 8th, 2003 edition of Fortune, and it begins, "Throughout his remarkable business and government career, Robert Rubin, now 65, has both worked exhaustively at reaching well-founded conclusions and rejected the idea that anything, and he means anything, can be a, quote, provable certainty." Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan once joshed Rubin about that proposition, telling him that, quote, all is uncertain is inherently contradictory because it asserts that uncertainty itself is uncertain. Wow, follow that logic. It goes on, being interviewed in his large Citigroup office, sitting in a red leather chair in his usual somber suit, white shirt, and dark tie, Rubin grew momentarily confused as to what day of the week it was. This writer supplied an assist. It's Wednesday, and that's a provable certainty. Rubin at first didn't argue. Quote, even in an uncertain world, I'm prepared to stipulate that it's Wednesday, end quote. But then, retreating, he said he would so stipulate quote, except for the cognitive issues of whether anybody knows anything, except for that caveat, end quote. So my question to you is, do you believe that perception is reality? Now I understand there's an anecdotal use of that term for people seeing certain circumstances and interpreting them a certain way, but when it comes to truth, is perception really reality? And I would argue that it's absolutely not. Reality is reality. So what are the implications for this, for us constantly saying, well, perception's reality, and in any particular situation, that reality is what you interpret it to be rather than what it really is? So let's delve into some of the features of solipsism. And first is that because anything that exists outside of the mind is in doubt or may not exist at all, then pursuing that information or that knowledge is pointless. Nothing really matters. And if that's the case, there is no truth. Secondly, there is no such thing as knowledge, even if truth existed. And third, even if truth and knowledge existed, it could not be communicated to another human being. So we have to understand that in order to pursue truth and to certainly obtain it, we have to begin by this first leap of faith. This first step is to suspend our disbelief and understand that there's a possibility that truth can be discovered and known. So a logical question that comes up is, well, if people and institutions are forwarding ideas like solipsism, aren't they to blame? Isn't it them who is causing all of this strife and these issues? And I've struggled with this for a long time, and initially I thought that was the case. In fact, until very recently I thought that was the case. I was, in my studies and research, looking to find out who they were and try to follow that rabbit hole. And it's interesting, and I certainly do think that there are theys out there who do have responsibility, but they don't have the ultimate responsibility in this. And that falls to us, because even though they have the reach of academia and the media and certainly almost unlimited financial resources, this really comes back to us. And George Carlin has a great piece that we're going to watch now that I think really illustrates this.
Now, there's one thing you might have noticed I don't complain about. Politicians. Everybody complains about politicians. Everybody says they suck. Yeah! Well, where do people think these politicians come from? They don't fall out of the sky. They don't pass through a membrane from another reality. They come from American parents and American families, American homes, American schools, American churches, American businesses, and American universities, and they're elected by American citizens. This is the best we can do, folks. This is what we have to offer. It's what our system produces. Garbage in, garbage out. If you have selfish, ignorant citizens, you're going to get selfish, ignorant leaders. And term limits ain't going to do you any good. You're just going to wind up with a brand new bunch of selfish, ignorant Americans. So maybe it's not the politicians who suck. Maybe something else sucks around here. Like the public. Yeah, the public sucks. There's a nice campaign slogan for somebody.
Ouch. But it's true. It has always been the case that it is our responsibility as sovereign human beings to protect ourselves from these tools. So if we say that freedom and truth are so important, we have to understand and acknowledge that we've been making a fundamental mistake since basically the time that we have been organizing ourselves. We have outsourced critical aspects of our lives to third parties, perceived authorities, in exchange for comfort and for ease. So I'll give you an example. We don't need to have a relationship with the food that we eat, right? Because a long time ago, economists told us, well, there's this thing called division of labor. So we need to focus on what we know best and let farmers and food preparers do all of that for us. And so we just go to a grocery store now, right? But in the process, we have lost something that is so critical. We lose the understanding of what makes that thing, in this case food, so precious to us and why our involvement in it is so important. A new concept I want to share is that within us, there is operating this three-part continuum. And it is so we think, so we feel, and so we act. And these form the pillars of consciousness that we'll talk about in a bit. But really, the question is there a contradiction between the three? In order for us to be the most complete individuals, for us to not endure suffering, for us to avoid those internal conflicts, these three things, thought, emotion, and action, must be in alignment. So I would ask you as you reflect, are yours in alignment? Do you think, feel, and act or behave in a consistent manner? Now, those who would intend to manipulate us, and I would say it's a relatively small group, but it's a very powerful group. They act on their advanced knowledge of things like the human psyche, consciousness, natural law, to deceive and manipulate us. So a question, what is the first thing you think of when you hear the word occult? Now be careful here because I'm talking about occult, O-C-C-U-L-T, not cult, C-U-L-T. So do you conjure things of evil, dark, certainly something that might be antithetical to Christian or other mainstream religious beliefs? Well, actually, the word occult simply means hidden, and it comes from the Latin verb occultare, which means to be hidden from sight. But why is this word so associated with negative connotations? And my question is it possible? Is it just possible that it's intentional? So with your understanding of human nature, what you know, let's go back to episode 1 where I told you to engage in probabilistic thinking. With what you know of human nature and the tendency of some individuals to use knowledge to their advantage, what do you think someone would be expected to do if they had this information? If I had information that I thought was valuable and I wanted to keep hidden, but it was readily available, I knew it was out there, what would I do? Of course, I could try to hide it and go through those efforts, but that's difficult. Would it be easier instead to try to manipulate the terminology and take something, for example, like the word occult, which means hidden, and turn it into occult, meaning satanic or evil or dark? I think it's quite reasonable. And let's talk about Orwellian doublespeak, because I think this is really what this is all about. You take a word and you completely turn it on its head, which is not exactly what we have in this case, because occult does not mean good or light, but it does mean hidden, and then when we take it to mean and be defined as dark or evil, we're basically using doublespeak. And let's take a look at an interview from 1989 on C-SPAN, and I think this will really give you some insight into what doublespeak is all about and what its impacts are.
William Lutz, what is doublespeak?
Doublespeak is language designed to evade responsibility, make the unpleasant appear pleasant, the unattractive appear attractive. Basically, it's language that pretends to communicate but really doesn't. It is language designed to mislead while pretending not to.
Is it done consciously?
Oh, yes, very consciously. Doublespeak is not a slip of the tongue or a mistaken use of language. It's exactly the opposite. It is language used by people who are very intelligent and very sophisticated in the use of language and know that you can do an awful lot with language.
Who's the worst offender?
In sheer bulk,
Yes.
sheer numbers of examples, the government. If we count government from the local level all the way up to the federal level, I had to stop writing the chapter on government doublespeak. It was going to take over the whole book. But interestingly enough, and this was a revelation in doing the book, about a half a step behind comes business with a tremendous amount of doublespeak.
How long has the government been using doublespeak?
I think of government as the third oldest profession, and probably from the moment government was instituted, doublespeak came with it. I cite examples from the 5th century BC in Greece, Julius Caesar, when he pacified Gaul. Of course, Nazi Germany thrived on doublespeak. So it's been around for quite a while.
So the point here is that the word occult means neither good nor evil. It simply means hidden. And this is critical, so please keep that in mind as we move forward. So let's talk about knowledge. Knowledge obviously can be very helpful and positive, but it can also be detrimental and negative. It can be useless and even counterproductive if it's in the hands of someone who is hyper-focused on the value and meaning of that knowledge. So knowledge simply means information, no surprise there. But something that I found very interesting is what the definition or meaning of wisdom is. And I didn't have a strong footing here until recently. And wisdom really is properly applied knowledge. So when we hear the term spoken all the time, knowledge is power, I don't think that's true. Wisdom is power. Knowledge that is properly applied is power, which is wisdom. It's also important to understand that consciousness can be strengthened or compromised or even manipulated through knowledge. And what I want to show you now is a video. It's an interview with Matthias Desmet, and you may have seen this. Through the last few years, he has been prominent in discussing this idea of mass formation and what it's all about. So let's take a look.
A mass formation is a typical kind of group formation, which has a very specific characteristic impact on individual mental functioning. One of the most remarkable effects of mass formation on individual psychological functioning is that it makes people radically incapable of taking a critical distance from what the group believes in. So once people are in the grip of this process of mass formation, they will typically become blind for the absurd characteristics of the groupthink, of what the group believes in. And this goes quite far. The people who are in the grip of mass formation can truly believe the most absurd things, even if it concerns people who are usually highly intelligent and highly educated. That's something very characteristic. We could even say that historical examples show that the higher the level of education, the more vulnerable people are for mass formation. And also these people, highly educated, sometimes highly intelligent, tend to be capable to believe in the most absurd things. I could give numerous other examples from the large-scale mass formations that happened in the Soviet Union, in Nazi Germany, during the witch hunts, during the Crusades, during the French Revolution. A second important characteristic of mass formation is that people who are in the grip of it seem to become radically unaware. It is as if they don't realize anymore that they lose many things while being in the grip of mass formation that used to be extremely important to them. So people seem to lose all awareness of their individual, egoistic interests. People who are in the grip of a mass formation can lose everything. And the leaders of the masses can take everything away of the people who are in the mass formation without the people noticing it. A third characteristic, which is also very important of people who are in the mass formation, is that they become radically intolerant for dissonant voices. It is as if they are radically allergic, as if they cannot stand anymore that people think differently, or that it is as if they do not permit any individuality deviating from the group norm. That's actually one of the major effects of mass formation, and this can go quite far. People in a mass typically tend to stigmatize everyone who doesn't go along with the masses. And in the end, they typically give signs to the people who do not join the mass. And the ultimate step is that they try to destroy these people. And they try to destroy these people in a typical way. They try to destroy these people as if it is their ethical duty to do so.
So a question to you, is it possible that you have been a participant in a mass formation, or that you have been manipulated in this way? So there are two ways that consciousness manifests. Let's go into that. They appear to be in opposition, but they're actually symbiotic. And the first is internally. So that is the feminine aspect. It's passive, intuitive. It involves the right hemisphere of our brain. It deals with mercy, care, intuition, and emotions. And then the second manifestation of consciousness is external. And this is masculine or dominant. It's analytical, logical, has to do with the left hemisphere of our brain. And this is energy that's all about how our consciousness shows up in the world. So ultimately the goal, again, in talking about alignment of all of these things, we need to align the internal and external components of our consciousness. As we feel, so we act. And to bring these into alignment reduces suffering. When they are out of alignment is when we experience suffering. The justifications and excuses and even reasons, if we can call them that, to defend actions we know that we shouldn't engage in are morally indefensible. When we do this, we're acting in opposition with ourselves and with our own consciousness. So it's pretty interesting that what I described before as these tools that people who would be inclined to take advantage of us use, we actually use on ourselves. It's ironic, we're largely aware of the tactics that are used on us, and yet we use them on ourselves to convince ourselves that what we're doing is right when in fact it's wrong. Again, this is an imbalance that's the reason for the experience that we have painful situations, that we experience pain in our lives. So are there solutions? Yes, but to do so we have to engage in creative problem solving. And the only way to solve this problem comes full circle again, and it is with the understanding of ourselves. I came across this video of Michael Tsarian, who is a giant in the field of truth, of consciousness, and so many other subjects. And I thought he really did a fine job of highlighting what we're all about, what our real purpose is.
We are here to discover and investigate together, to look at a very fascinating subject that is very much part of our own spiritual journey. I said in Bath, I talked 2 weeks ago in Bath, and I said there that this is certainly not infotainment, and it's not even food for the brain. This is ultimately about one's own spiritual development. You're here to discover who you are.
If all of this is true, it begs the question, why? Why do we not have this understanding of ourselves? And more importantly, I would ask, why do we not have an interest in pursuing that understanding? So what I'd like to do now is play an audio clip from you from a lecture by Manly P. Hall. And I think this may have been in the 50s or 60s, I'm not sure. But I want to give you a little bit of background on Manly Hall. He lived from 1901 to 1990 and was a Canadian author, lecturer, astrologer, and mystic. Over his 70-year career, he gave thousands, that's according to Wikipedia. I looked it up and I found that he had actually given 8,000 lectures, including 2 at Carnegie Hall, and published over 150 volumes, of which the best known is The Secret Teachings of All Ages. His book challenged assumptions about society's spiritual roots, which made readers view them in new and diverse ways. That was the key summary that I could find on the book, to give you an idea of what it was about. But essentially, he went back and created in this tome basically an encyclopedia of hidden and secret knowledge from way, way back. Hall was also a knight patron of the Masonic Research Group of San Francisco. He was recognized as a 33rd degree Mason, which is the highest honor conferred by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite. So I know red flags come up there, but keep in mind, and we will get into this later, that Masonic orders and fraternal orders, secret societies as they're called today, are not necessarily dark or evil. There is light occultism and there is dark occultism, but just keep that in mind. I wanted to point out that he was a Mason because I didn't want to hide that, but at the same time, keep in mind that when we think of the Freemasons, the Masonic order, we typically go to a very dark place, but that's not necessarily the case. And here's that audio.
But in any event, our private life now becomes an escape. It becomes an opportunity to let down barriers. We consider that we have earned the right to waste our private lives. We do it with a good spirit under the general term freedom. We really believe that we are so tired from work that we must play uproariously to compensate for this exhaustion. And in our Western pattern of things, this work and play pattern has come to so dominate everyone that resistance to it seems to be an effort to go against the prevailing stream of life.
So what happens when we take someone like Hall has described, who pours all of their effort and attention into their work, and they use that as justification to be able to basically waste their private lives? Even if that person has, for example, a really good understanding of poker, if we set them at a poker table against a very advanced player, we know what's going to happen, right? The advanced player knows not only the game, the moves, the tactics, but they're also very adept at understanding their competition, the other player or players. And so they understand behavior, they understand psychology, and that is really where they have the advantage. And the advanced player also makes calculated moves. They will sacrifice certain hands. They will play certain hands a certain way to indicate a strategy or behavior to throw the other player off. What we have then is, to put in gambling terms, the odds are heavily stacked in the favor of the advanced player and not in the novice. We can take this example of poker with just two players and apply it more broadly. We have to know that people in institutions with knowledge that they would use to their benefit or even against humanity work tirelessly. They focus as much on using that information as we do in avoiding it. So what do we expect the outcome will be when we have an advanced, focused, very knowledgeable opponent who understands and utilizes knowledge about human beings and their frailties against this? Let's now go into the three expressions of consciousness. And the first is thoughts. These are neither internal nor external, and they are an essence. And it's important to understand that every experience we have had originated as thought. The second is emotions, and this is the internal aspect of consciousness. This is how we express ourselves internally through feelings and emotions. This is the spirit in which we do things, which I like that description a lot. Finally, actions. These are where thoughts and emotions come together and result in a synthesis we call behavior. It's the child or byproduct of thoughts and emotions combining. So you have probably noticed as we've gone through this material that many of these concepts and information come in groups of three. And in different mystical traditions, this is known as the law of three, or the triune aspect of consciousness. And we can see it in many religions across the world. So we're now going to go into the triune aspect. And that deals with the human brain, the physical structure. And there is a significant lack of knowledge of how it operates, its major structures, and how they're directly tied to some of our basic human motivations. So let's take a look at this anatomy of the brain. The oldest and simplest portion of the brain is lowest physically and is at the base. It's called the reptilian brain, or R complex, and it controls physical activity and motor skills. It has two parts, the brainstem and the cerebellum. All muscle movement is governed here. It controls fight and flight mechanisms because of earlier evolutionary history of engaging with predators and threats. And I'm talking real threats, not like forgetting your Netflix password. Fight or flight is another term for stress. During times of stress, i.e. fight or flight scenarios, blood flow is diverted away from our brains and internal organs into our extremities in anticipation of a fight, where we'll have to use our arms, or flight, where we use our legs to run away. What is one of the most prolific states in our modern existence? And I would ask it this way. What do you hear when you meet someone for the first time, certainly, or you catch up with someone you haven't seen in a while and you say, "How are you doing?" or "How have you been?" I don't know what you hear, but almost to a person I hear busy, which can be interpreted as stress, right? So we're talking here about stress. So that means a vast majority of us are living our lives from the reptilian brain much of the time. And further evidence on how we react or overreact is seen in how we treat benign issues that we encounter every day, but we see them as existential threats, just like the reptilian brain does. And so here's a good example.
I have to restart my potatoes. Put way too much milk. Potatoes, I put too much cream in them. I have to restart.
So then a question. Let's go back to episode 1 where I encouraged you to engage in probabilistic thinking. And if you haven't seen that, essentially this is determining what is probably true. It's using your own judgment and wisdom, information that you have available to you, and your logic and reasoning to come up with what you think is most likely true. And then I would ask a question about this stress and reptilian brain issue that we're discussing. Is it possible that this points to an obvious imbalance between how we do and should organize ourselves and function and interact with one another? If that's true, what does it say for the sanity of how we currently live? So back to the brain. We see that we have now the mammalian brain, the second portion of the brain which formed and evolved on top of the reptilian brain. It governs emotional makeup, which is the chemical interactions through which we experience our emotions. This differentiates us from reptiles, which are creatures only of instinct. So I'd give you an example here. This would be the example of a dog, a mammal, and an alligator. We know and can see that the dog experiences happiness and sadness, but not an alligator. And this dog, I can tell you, is very happy. And the third component is the human or thinking brain, also referred to as the telencephalon. Now it has 5 structures in total, but I want to point out 2 of them. The first is the limbic system, and this supports emotion, behavior, and long-term memory functions. The second is the cerebral cortex, and this is what we often hear referred to as gray matter, and it's involved in memory, attention, perceptual awareness, thinking, language, and consciousness. And it is organized into 2 halves called the right and left hemispheres, or right and left brains. And here we have a diagram of the cerebral cortex where we have those right and left hemispheres. So the right is the feminine aspect. It governs intuition, which is simple knowing, or we also refer to it as gut reaction. It involves creativity, art, music. The left brain, on the other hand, is masculine and is the male aspect. It governs analytical thought, mathematical thought, and the use of words and language. And I really liked this diagram because it puts the left brain in that black and white and the right in that more colored type of presentation. The proper functioning of the brain exists where those 2 hemispheres, the left and the right brain, are in balance, as we've talked about with many of these other systems. So both left and right brain need to be active, engaged, and communicating with one another. And then finally, I find it very interesting that the triune model is the basis for the Trinity. It's also found in human consciousness in our thoughts, emotions, and actions model, and the human brain with its 3-part triune brain. Well, we've covered a lot today. I hope this has been helpful and informative, but mostly I hope it's brought up some subjects that will cause you to do some thinking and some subjects and some knowledge that you'll want to pursue and investigate on your own. Thanks for being here, and I look forward to seeing you next time.